Millionaire dad took his son in a wheelchair on a blind date. Only one girl brought him a flower first. David had always been a man of ambition, someone who built his life from the ground up. Born into a modest family, he had worked tirelessly to make a name for himself. He had climbed the corporate ladder, moved into a luxurious home, and surrounded himself with expensive things. However, amidst all his success, something was missing. He had never truly focused on his family. He was often too busy with meetings, business trips, and the demands of running a growing empire. David's son, Ethan, had grown up with all the comforts money could buy. But there was a cloud hanging over his life. When Ethan was a child, a tragic accident had changed everything. While most kids were playing sports and hanging out with friends, Ethan was forced to live with a disability that left him confined to a wheelchair. The accident had been devastating for the whole family, but especially for Ethan. It left him feeling isolated and different from other children. And over time, it became clear that his father's attention was mostly focused on his career rather than his son's emotional needs. For David, it had been easier to focus on work rather than face the painful reality of seeing his son struggle. He had tried to support him in his own way, buying him the latest gadgets, enrolling him in online classes, and making sure his medical needs were met. But David had never truly understood what his son needed emotionally. Ethan needed someone to talk to, someone to help him cope with the loneliness that came with living in a wheelchair. He longed for the sense of belonging and connection that most people took for granted. But David had been too caught up in his own world to notice. As Ethan grew older, David realized that his son was becoming more withdrawn. It hurt him to see Ethan this way, but he didn't know how to help. He had always been the provider, the protector, but this was a situation where money and resources couldn't fix the problem. One evening, as David was sitting in his office, his mind wandered to thoughts of Ethan. He thought about how his son had always been kind, intelligent, and full of potential. But now, those qualities seemed buried beneath a veil of loneliness and sadness. Ethan had never been the same since the accident, and David knew that the boy he once knew was slipping further away every day. It was then that David had an idea. He knew that Ethan needed more than just material things. He needed to connect with the world in a way that would give him the confidence to step outside of his isolation. Ethan had always been interested in relationships, and David had seen how much he longed for companionship. He knew his son had never been on a real date, and he believed that a positive experience could be the turning point that Ethan needed to rediscover his sense of self-worth. David decided to set up a blind date for Ethan. It wasn't something that came naturally to him, but he was willing to do anything to help his son. He reached out to a few of his friends who had daughters around Ethan's age. After some discussion, he arranged a date at one of the most popular restaurants in the city. It was a beautiful, upscale place, an elegant setting that would offer a memorable experience. David knew that Ethan would be nervous, but he also knew that the experience could open new doors for him. It might help him find confidence in himself and give him the opportunity to meet someone who would appreciate him for who he was. When David told Ethan about the blind date, his son's reaction wasn't what he had hoped for. Ethan didn't show excitement or joy. Instead, he appeared anxious and reluctant. The idea of being on a date in his wheelchair made him uncomfortable. He had always worried that people would judge him for his disability, and he wasn't sure how to handle the situation. For years, he had avoided social gatherings, not because he didn't want to go, but because he feared the awkward stares, the questions, and the sympathy that often followed him wherever he went. He was used to people treating him differently, and he didn't want to be reminded of it in a setting that was supposed to be fun and relaxed. David could see the hesitation in Ethan's eyes, but he also saw the small flicker of hope. It was clear that Ethan wanted to connect with someone, but the fear of rejection was holding him back. David knew this would be a big step for his son, so he did his best to reassure him. He told Ethan that this wasn't about finding love or perfection, but simply about enjoying the experience and making new memories. Ethan reluctantly agreed to go, though it was obvious that he wasn't convinced. The day of the date arrived, and David made sure everything was set. He arranged for a wheelchair-accessible vehicle to pick them up and take them to the restaurant. Ethan was dressed in his best clothes, a nice button-up shirt and dark jeans. His hair was neatly combed, and he wore a clean, fresh scent that David had picked out for him. Despite the effort, Ethan's nerves were still raw. He tried to calm himself, but the thought of sitting across from a girl he didn't know in a fancy restaurant made his palms sweat. He couldn't shake the feeling that he would somehow embarrass himself or be judged. David, on the other hand, was quietly hopeful. He believed this date could be a turning point for his son, a way for him to experience something beyond his limitations. He didn't expect miracles, but he knew that the right connection could change Ethan's perspective on the world. As they arrived at the restaurant, David looked over at Ethan. He could see the unease in his son's eyes, but he also saw a hint of curiosity. Maybe, just maybe, this evening would bring a new chapter in their lives. David hoped that Ethan would have the opportunity to see that the world still had something wonderful to offer him. Little did they know, the night would unfold in a way neither of them had anticipated. The evening had arrived, and despite the excitement that David tried to put on, he could tell that Ethan was not entirely at ease. The car ride to the restaurant felt longer than usual. Ethan stared out of the window, his gaze distant. He had done his best to prepare for the date, but he couldn't shake the sense of unease that lingered in his chest. He had never been on a blind date before, and the idea of sitting across from a girl he didn't know, especially while in a wheelchair, was enough to make him second-guess his decision. Even though his father tried to encourage him, it wasn't easy to believe that this would be anything other than another uncomfortable experience. David, however, was doing his best to keep things light. Just remember, it's not about impressing anyone. It's about having a good time. You've got this, Ethan, he said with a reassuring smile. Ethan nodded but couldn't fully shake the nervousness that gripped him. His father's words were comforting, but they didn't quiet the voice in his head that kept reminding him of his insecurities. As they approached the restaurant, Ethan felt a wave of anxiety sweep over him. The restaurant was stunning, with elegant chandeliers lighting up the space and soft music playing in the background. It was the kind of place where people dressed up to enjoy fine dining, and the atmosphere made everything seem more formal and intimidating. It was a far cry from the casual dinners Ethan had grown used to, and the thought of being in such a sophisticated setting only made him feel more out of place. When they entered, the host greeted them with a warm smile and led them to their reserved table. The restaurant was buzzing with conversation, the clinking of silverware, and the laughter of couples enjoying their meals. David wheeled Ethan to the table, and as they sat down, Ethan couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation. He glanced around nervously, hoping to spot the other girls who would be joining them. His eyes met the gaze of a few strangers, and he quickly looked away, wondering if they were silently judging him. Despite his father's best efforts to make him feel at ease, Ethan couldn't ignore the feeling that everyone was watching him. The first girl arrived, and she was exactly what Ethan had expected. She was polite but distant, barely making eye contact with him as she introduced herself. Her greeting was formal, and she immediately turned her attention to David, who was trying his best to make the conversation flow smoothly. Ethan smiled, but he felt disconnected from the conversation. As the other girls arrived, he noticed that they all seemed to follow the same pattern, polite but distant. They spoke to him as if he were someone to pity, a person whose disability defined him more than his personality. It made the whole experience feel like a show, where Ethan was the subject of the spectacle. It was all too much, and the nerves that had been bubbling inside him now began to reach a boiling point. Throughout the evening, the other girls spoke in short sentences, their eyes darting around the room, clearly uncomfortable. Ethan tried to make small talk, but it was hard to connect with anyone who seemed more focused on his wheelchair than on him. He had never liked the feeling of being seen as different, but tonight, it was all too obvious. The girls' glances, the awkward silences, it all piled on top of him, and he felt himself withdrawing further into his shell. David, noticing the tension in the air, tried his best to steer the conversation in a direction that would make everyone feel more comfortable. He joked around, telling light-hearted stories about his business trips and asking the girls about their hobbies. But every time David tried to lighten the mood, Ethan felt himself sinking deeper into discomfort. The polite smiles and forced laughter only made it worse. He wasn't sure if the girls were just being nice because they had to be, or if they genuinely saw him as someone they could connect with. Either way, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he didn't belong there. Just as he began to retreat into his thoughts, he noticed something different. A girl walked into the restaurant, and the first thing Ethan saw was her confident stride. She wasn't like the others. She wasn't hesitating or looking around nervously. There was a calm assurance in her movement that immediately caught Ethan's attention. She was tall, with long brown hair that framed her face, and she exuded a sense of warmth that made her seem approachable. As she approached the table, Ethan noticed the way she smiled at him, genuine, unguarded, and without hesitation. Unlike the others, she didn't look at him with pity or awkwardness. She walked straight up to him, extended her hand, and said, "Hi, I'm Emma. It's so nice to meet you." Her voice was soft, yet confident, and when Ethan looked into her eyes, he felt an instant connection. It was as if she saw him not as a person in a wheelchair, but as someone worthy of her attention. For the first time that evening, Ethan felt like he was just another person, not defined by his disability. Emma's presence was like a breath of fresh air, and it felt like the whole atmosphere of the restaurant had shifted. As she reached into her bag, Ethan couldn't help but wonder what she was doing. She pulled out a single flower, a simple yet beautiful rose, and handed it to him with a warm smile. Ethan's eyes widened in surprise. No one had ever done that for him before. In that moment, all the nerves, all the discomfort, all the uncertainty vanished. He had been expecting awkwardness, but Emma had brought him something unexpected, a sense of acceptance. The other girls at the table looked on in silence, but for Ethan, the gesture meant everything. He couldn't remember the last time someone had treated him with such kindness, and it made him feel like he wasn't invisible. He took the flower gently and smiled, feeling a warmth spread through him that he hadn't felt in years. Emma's small but meaningful gesture had instantly put him at ease, and he felt himself opening up in a way he hadn't expected. There was no need for pretense or discomfort. There was just a simple, shared moment between two people. David, watching the exchange, couldn't help but feel proud of his son. He had seen how Ethan had struggled in the past, how he had always kept to himself, afraid of being judged. But now, in this moment, David saw his son in a new light. Ethan wasn't just the young man in a wheelchair. He was someone who deserved to be seen, to be valued, and to be respected. David knew that this was a turning point for Ethan. This was the beginning of something new. Emma had done something no one else had done all evening. She had made Ethan feel like he mattered. As the night went on, Ethan found himself talking to Emma more than anyone else. They discussed everything, from their favorite books and movies to their dreams for the future. Emma wasn't afraid to ask him questions, to learn more about who he was, and to share her own thoughts and experiences. The connection between them grew stronger with every passing minute, and for the first time that evening, Ethan felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. As the evening unfolded, Ethan began to feel something he hadn't expected: comfort. Sitting across from Emma, the world around him seemed to fade away. The noise of the bustling restaurant, the clinking of glasses, and the chatter of other diners all became background noise. For the first time that evening, Ethan wasn't thinking about his wheelchair or how people might be judging him. Instead, he was simply enjoying Emma's company. Emma was different from the others. She wasn't trying to impress anyone, nor was she focused on Ethan's disability. She was just herself, genuine, warm, and kind. Their conversation flowed easily. They talked about their favorite books and the kinds of movies they loved. Ethan found himself laughing at her jokes, something he hadn't done in a long time. There was no awkwardness, no discomfort. He wasn't the boy in a wheelchair at that moment. He was just Ethan, the young man talking to a girl who was genuinely interested in him. As the evening went on, Emma asked about Ethan's life, his passions, and his goals. Ethan felt an urge to open up, something he hadn't done in a while. He shared stories about his childhood, his love for drawing, and his dream of becoming a graphic designer. He even told her about how, at times, he felt trapped in his wheelchair, unable to fully live the life he imagined for himself. But with Emma, he didn't feel like he had to explain himself. She listened, nodding, asking thoughtful questions, and sharing her own experiences. It felt like they were building a connection, one that wasn't based on sympathy or pity, but on understanding and shared interests. For the first time in a long while, Ethan felt seen, not as someone defined by his disability, but as someone with hopes, dreams, and a future. Emma's attention was not a burden, it was a gift. She didn't treat him differently because of his wheelchair, she treated him like anyone else. The more they talked, the more Ethan realized how rare that was for him. Most people only saw the wheelchair and forgot to see the person inside. But Emma saw him, truly saw him, and it made all the difference. David, sitting at the table with them, watched the conversation unfold. He saw the way Ethan's face lit up as he spoke with Emma, the way his posture shifted as he became more engaged in the conversation. He was no longer the quiet, withdrawn boy he had been when they first arrived at the restaurant. Ethan was coming out of his shell, and it was happening right before David's eyes. For the first time in years, David felt proud, not of his wealth or his accomplishments, but of his son, of the person he was becoming. David couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude toward Emma. She hadn't just been a date, she had been a catalyst for change in Ethan's life. She had given Ethan something he hadn't realized he needed, someone who accepted him without hesitation, someone who made him feel like he mattered. As a father, David knew that moments like this were precious. They were the moments that could shape a person's future, and he was witnessing one unfold in front of him. Throughout the dinner, the rest of the girls at the table remained polite but distant. They engaged in the conversation, but their eyes were not on Ethan in the same way Emma's were. David noticed that, while they occasionally smiled at Ethan and tried to include him in the conversation, they never made an effort to connect with him the way Emma had. The contrast was obvious. Emma wasn't just being nice to Ethan because she felt obligated to, she was genuinely interested in him. There was no pretense, no awkwardness. She was simply being herself, and it was enough to make Ethan feel like he could truly be himself too. David's thoughts were interrupted when the waiter arrived with their food. As the plates were set down, Ethan smiled at the delicious spread before him, but his mind wasn't on the food. It was on Emma and how she had made him feel. They continued to talk through dinner, and with each passing minute, Ethan felt more at ease. The pressure he had felt earlier had lifted, and in its place was a sense of calm he hadn't known he needed. Even though the evening was far from over, Ethan realized that this was already a win for him. The other girls at the table had long since finished their meals and were now focused on other things. Some were scrolling through their phones, while others engaged in polite conversation with David. But Ethan and Emma were lost in their own little world, talking about everything and nothing at all. They joked about the books they had read, debated the merits of their favorite movies, and shared stories about their families. It was the kind of conversation that felt natural and easy, nothing forced or uncomfortable. For the first time that evening, Ethan wasn't worried about what others thought. He was simply enjoying being in the moment. As dessert was served, Ethan noticed the small smile that had never left Emma's face. It was genuine, warm, and inviting. She was completely present in the conversation, and Ethan could see that she was enjoying the time they were spending together just as much as he was. It was an unfamiliar feeling for him, being around someone who didn't make him feel different. David looked over at his son and couldn't help but smile. It was clear that Ethan had found someone who understood him in a way no one else had. Emma wasn't intimidated by his disability or bothered by it. She simply accepted him as he was, and that acceptance meant everything to Ethan. David knew that this was a turning point in his son's life, a moment that would have long-lasting effects on his confidence and his view of the world. As the evening drew to a close, Ethan found himself dreading the end of the night. He didn't want the conversation to stop, didn't want the connection to end. He had never imagined that a blind date could turn into something so meaningful. When the check arrived, David paid, and they began to gather their things to leave. Ethan's heart sank as he realized that this night, which had started with so much anxiety and uncertainty, was now coming to an end. Emma, sensing his discomfort, gave him a reassuring smile. "I really enjoyed tonight, Ethan," she said, her voice warm and sincere. "We should do this again sometime." Ethan's face lit up with a smile that reached all the way to his eyes. "I'd like that," he replied, feeling a sense of hope that he hadn't felt in years. David looked at his son, seeing the spark in his eyes. Ethan had made a real connection with someone, a connection that went beyond the surface, beyond his disability. It wasn't about impressing anyone, it was about being real. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan felt like he was enough just as he was. As they left the restaurant, David felt a sense of contentment wash over him. He had set up the date to help his son, but what had happened that night was so much more than he had hoped for. Ethan had found someone who saw him for who he truly was, and David knew that this was just the beginning of a new chapter in his son's life. one that was full of promise, hope, and the possibility of real connection. As the evening continued, the sense of ease between Ethan and Emma grew stronger. The awkwardness that had once defined the night had disappeared, replaced by an easy, comfortable rhythm. There was something special about the way Emma made Ethan feel. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't worried about how he was being perceived. He was simply being himself, and that made all the difference. The conversation flowed effortlessly. They talked about their childhoods, their families, and the things they were passionate about. Ethan shared stories about the art projects he'd worked on, the drawings he'd done over the years, and how he'd dreamed of becoming a graphic designer. Emma listened attentively, her eyes never straying from his. She asked questions, expressed genuine interest, and made Ethan feel like his dreams were just as important as anyone else's. For Ethan, this felt like a revelation. He had spent so much time feeling isolated, like he was different from everyone else because of his wheelchair. But Emma didn't see his disability as something to define him. She saw him as a person with hopes, ambitions, and a unique perspective on life. It was a feeling Ethan hadn't experienced before, and it made him feel more confident than he had in years. David watched all of this unfold from his seat at the table. He could see the change in Ethan, how his shoulders had relaxed, how his posture had straightened, and how his smile had become more genuine. For the first time that night, Ethan was fully engaged, not just in the conversation but in the world around him. It was as though Emma had unlocked a part of his son that had been hidden for so long. David had always known that his son was capable of great things. He had seen Ethan's potential, his creativity, and his intelligence, but he also knew that the accident had held him back. It had made him more self-conscious, more withdrawn. But tonight, watching Ethan talk freely with Emma, David saw something different. He saw the young man that Ethan had always been, the young man who had so much to offer the world, and he couldn't help but feel proud. The night wasn't just about Ethan having a good time. It was about his growth. David realized that the true value of this blind date wasn't about finding a romantic connection or impressing someone. It was about Ethan feeling accepted, feeling seen, and feeling confident in himself. Emma had done more than just show up for the date. She had given Ethan something that was far more valuable, his sense of self-worth. As dessert was served, Ethan found himself more and more at ease. He had always been skeptical of these kinds of situations, especially blind dates, but now he was beginning to understand why his father had pushed him to come. He wasn't sure if Emma was the one for him, or if this was the beginning of a romantic relationship, but he did know one thing: he had enjoyed himself. He had felt like a normal person, not someone defined by his wheelchair, and that was enough for him. Emma, too, seemed to be enjoying herself. As they ate their dessert, she continued to engage Ethan in light-hearted conversation, asking him about his favorite places to visit and the kind of art he liked to create. She seemed genuinely interested in getting to know him, not out of politeness, but because she saw something in him. There were no awkward pauses in their conversation. Everything flowed naturally. It was as if they had known each other for years, even though it had only been a few hours. At one point, Emma mentioned that she loved hiking and had been on several trips with friends. Ethan's interest piqued, and he asked her about her favorite hiking spots. She spoke with excitement, describing the beautiful trails and the breathtaking views. As she spoke, Ethan realized that he had never really considered the outdoors in the same way. He had always been focused on his limitations, but listening to Emma, he began to think about the possibilities. Maybe there were places he could visit, maybe there were things he could do, even with his wheelchair. Emma had made him see the world in a new light. David watched the interaction with a smile on his face. He could see the shift in Ethan's perspective, how the conversation with Emma had helped him open up in ways he never had before. Ethan was no longer hiding behind his wheelchair. He was actively engaging with the world, with Emma, and with life itself. It was a moment of growth, and David couldn't have been more proud of his son. As the evening wore on, the restaurant began to empty out. The last few diners were finishing their meals, and the staff started to clean up. It was a sign that the night was coming to an end. But for Ethan, it didn't feel like it had to end. He didn't want the connection with Emma to stop. He had spent so much of his life feeling disconnected from others. But now, after this evening, he realized that connection was possible. It wasn't about the wheelchair or the way people looked at him. It was about being open, being himself, and allowing others to see him for who he really was. Emma seemed to feel the same way. As the check arrived, she looked at Ethan and smiled. "I had a really great time tonight," she said, her voice sincere. "I'd love to do this again sometime if you're up for it." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected to have such a meaningful connection with someone in such a short amount of time. But here was Emma, telling him that she enjoyed spending time with him and that she wanted to see him again. It was everything Ethan had hoped for but never thought he could have. He smiled back at her, feeling a warmth in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. "I'd like that too," he replied. David watched the exchange between his son and Emma with pride. He had seen the transformation in Ethan tonight, the way he had come alive, the way he had found a connection with someone who saw him for who he truly was. David knew that this was just the beginning. Tonight wasn't just about a blind date. It was about Ethan taking the first step toward a more fulfilling life, one where he could embrace who he was and what he had to offer. As they left the restaurant, Ethan felt a sense of peace that had eluded him for so long. He was no longer the person who hid in the shadows, afraid of what others thought. He was someone who had experienced something real, something meaningful. And he owed it all to Emma, who had shown him that being himself was enough. As Ethan and Emma walked out of the restaurant, the cool night air hit them, and for the first time in a long while, Ethan felt at peace. The tension that had clouded his thoughts all evening had finally melted away. His mind wasn't filled with worries about what others thought of him, nor was he thinking about how he might embarrass himself. He was simply present, enjoying the moment. Emma and Ethan walked side by side, the sound of their footsteps mingling with the occasional hum of traffic in the background. It felt natural, effortless. Ethan found himself smiling more than he had in a long time, not because he was trying to impress anyone, but because he was genuinely happy. The connection he had with Emma was something unexpected, something beautiful. He had gone into the evening with low expectations, unsure of what to expect, but now he felt different. He felt like he had taken a step forward in his life, a step toward being more than just the boy in a wheelchair. Emma glanced at him as they walked, her smile warm and easy. "I'm really glad we did this," she said, her voice soft. "I wasn't sure what to expect, but this has been really nice." Ethan nodded, his heart racing a little at how sincere she sounded. "Yeah, me too," he replied, feeling the sincerity of the words. "I didn't know I needed this, but I'm really glad we did it." They stopped for a moment outside the restaurant, where a few people were still lingering. The city around them was alive, but in that moment, it felt like just the two of them were there. Ethan felt an unusual calm settle over him as he looked at Emma. It was clear that their connection wasn't just about the date itself. It was about something deeper, something that had sparked between them. She didn't treat him like someone to pity. She didn't see him as his disability. She saw him as a person, someone with thoughts, dreams, and emotions, and that made all the difference in the world. As they talked more about their plans for the future, it became clear how much they had in common. They both shared a love for creativity, for the arts, and for the little moments in life that often went unnoticed. Ethan had always felt isolated, partly because of his disability, but also because he often felt that others couldn't relate to his experiences. But Emma was different. She didn't shy away from asking about his dreams, his passions, or the things that made him happy. Instead of focusing on the limitations he had lived with for years, she focused on his abilities, his strengths, and the things that made him unique. By the time they reached the car, Ethan was feeling something he hadn't felt in years: hope. It wasn't just about the possibility of a romantic relationship. It was about feeling like he had a future. For so long, he had been caught up in his own self-doubt, convinced that his disability was the thing that defined him. But Emma had made him see that it wasn't his disability that mattered. It was who he was, what he had to offer, and the way he chose to live his life. David, who had been quietly watching from a distance, could see the change in Ethan. His son's body language had shifted in a way that was impossible to ignore. Gone was the uncertainty and the hesitation. In its place was a young man who was more confident, more at ease in his own skin. David couldn't help but smile, knowing that this night had given Ethan something valuable, something he had been missing for far too long: self-confidence. As they drove home, Ethan couldn't stop thinking about the evening. He replayed the conversation he'd had with Emma over and over in his mind, remembering the way she had looked at him, listened to him, and made him feel like he mattered. He had never expected a simple date to have such an impact on him. But now, he was beginning to understand that this night was about more than just meeting someone new. It was about breaking down the walls he had built around himself, about learning to accept himself for who he was, and about realizing that he didn't have to hide anymore. When they arrived home, David helped Ethan out of the car and into the house. They walked together, the quiet of the evening settling in around them. David glanced at his son, seeing the thoughtful expression on Ethan's face. "How was it?" he asked, his voice filled with curiosity. Ethan smiled, looking up at his father. "It was amazing, Dad. I didn't think it would go like that. Emma's different. She's not like anyone else I've met." David nodded, understanding exactly what his son meant. "I'm glad to hear that, Ethan. It's important to meet people who see you for who you really are, not just what they think you are." Ethan felt a warmth spread through him at his father's words. It wasn't just the success of the date that made him feel good. It was the fact that his father understood, that he saw what had happened between him and Emma as something meaningful. It wasn't about impressing anyone or trying to make things look perfect. It was about finding a real connection, one that went beyond surface appearances. As the night wore on and Ethan settled into bed, his mind raced with thoughts of the evening. He couldn't help but feel a sense of pride in himself. For so long, he had held back, afraid of rejection and judgment. But tonight, he had taken a chance, and it had paid off. He had connected with someone who didn't see him as someone to pity or feel sorry for. She saw him for who he was, and that made all the difference. The next few days passed in a blur. Ethan and Emma kept in touch, exchanging messages and talking about everything from their favorite hobbies to their future aspirations. It was clear that they had built something real, something worth nurturing. Emma was just someone he had met on a blind date. She had become a part of his life, someone who made him feel seen, heard, and appreciated. Ethan began to notice the changes in himself as well. He felt more confident in social situations, more willing to open up and share his thoughts with others. He no longer felt like he had to hide behind his disability or be defined by it. Instead, he embraced who he was and began to see himself in a new light. He wasn't just someone in a wheelchair. He was someone with dreams, passions, and the ability to create meaningful connections. David noticed the change in his son as well. Ethan's mood had shifted in ways that were impossible to ignore. He was more engaged in life, more willing to take risks and put himself out there. David could see that Ethan was finally starting to believe in himself, something he had struggled with for so long. It wasn't just about the blind date. It was about the growth that had come with it, the realization that he was worthy of love, connection, and happiness. As the weeks passed, Ethan and Emma continued to grow closer. Their connection deepened, and Ethan felt more at peace with himself than he ever had before. He had learned that he didn't have to let his disability define him. It was just one part of who he was, and it didn't have to hold him back from living the life he wanted. For David, seeing his son's transformation was the most rewarding part of the whole experience. He had pushed Ethan to go on that blind date, hoping it would give him a chance to connect with someone, but he hadn't anticipated just how much it would change his son's life. Ethan had taken a huge step that night, and David knew that it was just the beginning of a new chapter in his son's life. A chapter full of hope, possibility, and the chance to truly live. The weeks following that unforgettable night felt like a new chapter in Ethan's life had begun. He couldn't stop thinking about Emma, about the way she made him feel so comfortable, so seen. He had always been cautious about letting people get too close, afraid that his disability would make him an outsider. But with Emma, none of that mattered. She treated him like anyone else, and for the first time in a long time, Ethan felt like he could just be himself. The texts and messages between them became more frequent. At first, their conversations had been casual, small talk about the things they liked, their favorite shows, their favorite books. But soon, the conversations deepened. They started talking about their dreams, their hopes, and the things that mattered most to them. Emma shared her desire to work in environmental conservation, and Ethan, as he had shared that night at dinner, talked about his passion for graphic design. They spent hours chatting about the future, their ideas about the world, and the places they wanted to visit. It wasn't just about getting to know each other. It was about finding common ground, understanding one another, and building something real. Ethan couldn't help but feel grateful. grateful for the chance to meet Emma, grateful for the connection they had, and grateful for the confidence he was beginning to feel in himself. It wasn't an instant change. There were still moments when his doubts crept in, when he would wonder if people really saw him for who he was, but those moments were becoming fewer. He had learned to look at himself differently. It wasn't about his wheelchair. It wasn't about the limitations he had. It was about the person he was inside, the person who deserved respect, kindness, and love just like anyone else. One Saturday afternoon, Emma suggested they meet again. This time, instead of a formal dinner, she proposed going to a local park, where they could enjoy the outdoors and take a walk. Ethan had never been someone to spend much time outside. He had always thought that outdoor activities weren't really meant for him, especially since his wheelchair made things more challenging. But when Emma mentioned it, something in Ethan's heart shifted. He wanted to try. He wanted to be open to new experiences, to see the world in a different way. He agreed to meet her at the park the following weekend. The day arrived, and Ethan felt a mixture of excitement and nerves. He had never done something like this before. What if the park was too difficult to navigate? What if he couldn't keep up? But as soon as he saw Emma waiting for him near the entrance, his worries seemed to fade. She was smiling, her face full of warmth, and as soon as she saw him, she waved and walked toward him. "Hey, Ethan, it's great to see you," she said, her voice filled with cheer. "Hey, Emma," he replied, returning her smile. "This is a new experience for me. Not sure how well I'll handle the park, but I'm excited to try." Emma laughed. "You're going to do great. I'm just happy we're doing this together." As they walked along the park's paved paths, Emma kept the conversation light and easy. She asked Ethan about his graphic design work, about his favorite projects, and they talked about their shared love for nature. The park was beautiful, with trees casting long shadows over the walkway and birds singing in the distance. Ethan noticed that, as they strolled, he wasn't thinking about his wheelchair. Instead, he was focused on the joy of being out in nature, enjoying the fresh air, and the simple pleasure of being with someone who made him feel completely at ease. At one point, they stopped near a small pond, and Emma pointed out a family of ducks swimming nearby. They laughed together as one of the ducks seemed to waddle away from the rest, causing the others to chase after it. Ethan had to admit he was having a great time. Being out here with Emma, away from the pressures of daily life, was exactly what he needed. It was the kind of moment that felt normal, natural, and uncomplicated. As they continued their walk, Emma asked, "What's something you've always wanted to do but haven't had the chance to?" Ethan thought for a moment. "I've always wanted to travel more. See places I've only read about. I think it's one of my biggest dreams, but you know, the wheelchair. It makes things complicated sometimes." Emma smiled at him. "I can't wait for you to get to experience that. I think traveling would be amazing for you. And I'm sure there are plenty of places you could go and explore, even with a wheelchair. It's all about finding the right spots." Her words made Ethan think. Maybe there were places he could go, things he could do, without letting his disability hold him back. The thought excited him. Traveling was something he had always dreamed of, but he had put it off, thinking it would be too difficult, too complicated. But with Emma's encouragement, he started to see the possibility in it, a world of adventure and new experiences waiting for him. As they continued to walk, they shared more stories, laughed at silly jokes, and simply enjoyed each other's company. Ethan realized that, in a way, this park outing was more than just a casual walk. It was symbolic of the changes that had been taking place in his life. With Emma, he didn't have to worry about fitting in or feeling different. He could just be himself, and that was enough. The more he spent time with her, the more he began to understand that the limitations he had placed on himself were often just in his mind. There were so many things he could do, so many places he could go, he just had to take the first step. After a few hours, the sun began to set, painting the sky with hues of pink and orange. It was a beautiful sight, one that made Ethan feel more connected to the world around him. He didn't want the day to end. He wanted to keep walking, keep talking, keep exploring this new chapter of his life with Emma. As they reached the park's exit, Emma turned to him and smiled. "I'm so glad we did this, Ethan," she said, her voice soft. "You're an incredible person, and I'm really lucky to have met you." Ethan felt his heart swell with warmth. "I feel the same way," he replied, his voice sincere. "I've learned so much from you already. You've made me realize that I can do so much more than I thought I could." They stood there for a moment, looking at each other. In that quiet moment, Ethan realized that this was more than just a day out at the park. It was the beginning of a new journey. A journey where he could live his life to the fullest, embrace new experiences, and continue to grow. And it was a journey he wouldn't have to take alone. As they said their goodbyes and Emma headed home, Ethan felt a renewed sense of hope and excitement for the future. He didn't know exactly where the road would lead, but he knew that with Emma by his side, anything was possible.